Can you hear me? Oh, that's so loud. I can tell. Can you hear me like this? Yeah, that's good. Okay. I don't know how to do look at my own notes, so I don't. I'm not. I have the option. But that's okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming so much. I really, really appreciate it. This is my first time doing something like this. It's pretty exciting, and I'm looking forward to kind of like breaking down just like what I've been doing in this publication project. Yeah. Okay. So. Just like a little introduction to what it is. It's a publication project about like the process of political research, or like I like this term partisan research that this group liaisons uses. I think it's pretty cool. But it's just like tracing out like the living dead, or like the living history of radical left movements, and like just like kind of calling together pieces of like really interesting or like illustrative examples of organization, ideas, and just general like spirit, if you will, from like past and present moments of revolt. And like often it is broken down in this way where it's like past organizations and present moments of kind of like more spontaneous action, which says something, I think. But it's a process that's like definitely rooted with like the contact that I've had for like the past 5 or so years with like grassroots social movement archiving. So I'm a big stand for this place called Interference Archive. I think it's like an amazing resource that I want more people to use. And so if you haven't heard about it before and you're hearing about it now, like, you know, please go, please check it out. It's like a really amazing resource. I feel like the method that I'm like using in this project is like, or like I'm trying to give it like a fun name or like a cool like framework. I realize it's kind of like a graphic meditation. It's like I used to think I bought a light box like 4 years ago, and I thought I was like cheating. I thought I was like a total fucking fraud for using a light box or something. But it's just like I found it also really calming and like meditative. So I think like graphic meditation, it's like I'd see it as like what I do, as you can see in like this image, is kind of just like trace stuff in like a pretty loose hand and like process or like notate around images that like I like seek out or like encounter somehow, and like the encounters are often through like just like a very like manic online habits, and then like I'll like with like this is a perfect example for me of like it's like not like my favorite piece of anything. It's just like something I did and sat on, and then like ended up like sending through an amazing Toshiba printer that no longer is with us. In like these different color channels, and so it's just like I don't know. A lot of what this project is like this kind of like spontaneous and improvisatory, kind of like free associative thing that I wish happened more quickly, but it doesn't. So it's I don't know. It's a dialectic. But I want to walk through some of like the like basic practices that I do with like the first issue, and then like really get into the content of like this one that I just put out and that we're like launching today, because it's kind of like the build up or like lead up to this more focused regional presentation or like kind of like focused project.
I have the app on my phone. If you want to add me as an editor, then you can plug your notes on there.
Oh.
You want to do that? Yeah. And if you like, you're just going to your computer and go share, and then share it with me so that I am.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're good. Let's okay. So this is like, I feel like this is the most, it's like the best example of like the living dead thing that I was talking about. It's like, you know, we've all seen like a million images of Che, and I think like there's this like heroization of him that like turns him into kind of like a rock star or something as a political figure, and I think that's, I was like, oh, I heard that this guy Thomas Sankara, he's like literally playing a guitar and like playing a PB amp, which is like what I do, and like he did this amazing. He was like this amazing visionary figure in the 80s who was assassinated because of like the kind of spirit and attitude and like structural like vision that he had, and so like I think what he's saying in this, like I picked a very specific quote that's kind of like exemplary of his life or his work. And I think what I try to do with the quotes a lot of time is like provide something that does a kind of like, you can kind of generalize from it in a lot of ways. You can see it from a lot of different angles, but it also speaks to like a very specific thing that it's addressing and like informs you a lot about that. And so I don't I don't know how other people receive these like excerpts that I pull out and accompany with like kind of like graphic meditation, but I hope that like, for example, with this one, like I hope that this resonates with people in the ways they're thinking about debt and reparations in the current moment, but also reminds them of like this larger picture of how debt is related to kind of to steal from or to like reference Walter Rodney, like how Europe underdeveloped Africa in general. So this is like the shining example of what I meant by like the living dead of radical left history. And then like a lot of the other things that I do is like about culling from like news media of the present day. So this is like, this palm leaf one is like one of my favorite things, and it's like one of the more like inscrutable pieces in that like first scene. But it's the only picture I could find of this prison break that I heard about during the NSARS protests in Nigeria in 2020, which was like it was like a special police force. It's called the SARS stands for Special Anti-Robbery Squad, and they're like an extraordinarily corrupt, violent arm of the police in Nigeria. And there's massive nationwide and even worldwide protests against them, and crazy shit happened, like prison breaks. And so like this example of like an amazing instance that's like totally gonna like fall under the radar in terms of like the international corporate news media, but you can kind of like savor it in some way or try to like represent it. And so that is like kind of in a page or in an image, like what I ideally want to be doing in this thing. It's just kind of like savoring these moments that would like otherwise like be kind of slipping through the cracks entirely. And like I don't even remember how I found out about this. This is just, again, like I said, from being in it online. But it's like important to me to like, okay, like this someone has to be able to like see this or like see this in another way. Similar thing goes for this picture of, it's like a woman trying to disarm a cop in Haiti. I think that's just like I don't know, it speaks for itself, it's like, to me, but I think it's like, it just feels like important to like, try to do something with those kind of sites, because we see a lot of, I don't know, stuff that's much like less inspiring. So. This is kind of my pivot to talking about South Asia, which is like the majority of what we're going to be talking about today. These were like two early examples of like me making work about South Asia, and they're more, again, in that contemporary vein. This like, the Strike to Survive is just like me procrastinating doing something else and finding pictures of the farmer strike when it was first happening and just like trying to draw it really like emotively. And then this other one is again this example of like working with these degraded images that come up just like by encounter. Like there was this video making the rounds on Twitter of like a bunch of iPhone factory workers destroying this subcontracting factory, like this company called Wistron, which is like a Foxconn or something, where iPhones are made, and they're just like ransacking the place. And I was like, oh, this is like amazing. Like I hate iPhones. I hate my life on iPhone. And it's like they clearly hate their life on iPhone making iPhones. So, you know, even though it was like a like insanely pixelated, like inscrutable thing, so, you know, something has to be done to savor that again. So this is kind of like just like practice in trying to like convey something about these moments that like pass across your perception somehow, and then like fuck, like you got to do something with it, and you know, so someone should be able to like see it in a kind of like concentrated way. And so yeah, a lot of the stuff that I do in this publication project is like about kind of like trolling like news media sources from like the global south, like kind of like more dinky ones with like bad pictures, and often they have this amazing category. It's like images for demonstration. So for the iPhone factory, there was like a picture of Wistron like blurred in the background, but then there's like barbed wire and a little rose sticking out. And it's an image for demonstration. And so it's like a little rose for the factory that got ransacked. Which I thought was like, I mean, there's other stuff too, just like a random picture of like a crashed car for this same event. Image for demonstration. It's like, I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. There's like an absurdity to it, and this is where like the only term I can like come up with or like reference is like surrealism, or like the traditions of the surreal, and I like that side of trying to represent like contemporary protests. I think it's more like fun or interesting sometimes than like the kind of very well framed, well like rehearsed activist TM capital A kind of stuff that we're like conditioned to kind of respond to or something. So these are just like, yeah, kind of like examples of practice, of the practice as it has like been forming in the past year. And then I want to move to like kind of breaking down some of that I had a lot of like pages that I wanted to talk about, because it's like this is a crazy opportunity for me to like hold you all hostage and having forgotten about this stuff. But Sunny had said that they want to talk about this one, so I want to maybe take a moment and see if they wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, hey, I'm Sunny.
I
work at Print and Matter, organizing the book fairs, among many other things, and I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, I'm just happy to launch this book and get it like really circulated and distributed and talk more about it, and it feels like the contents are so urgent. Yeah, I mean, there are things that I can say specifically about this page. I think like before I do so, maybe I can like zoom out a little bit and just talk about like when I discovered your work, Shiva, which was a few years ago at the actions at MDC around Jamal Floyd. So we were there, I don't know, like 2 years ago in the thick of it all. And Jamal Floyd was in custody at MDC in Sunset Park, Metropolitan Detention Center, and there were a lot of people, including his family, showing up for weekly noise demos. And you know, I think oftentimes with the recurring actions, there's like little contingencies that form. Me and my friends would pull up. The RevCom people were always there. And you know, you were distributing. This poster that actually I just looked at this for the first time, but it's in here somewhere.
I was just really taken by the print, and I still have it, and it was also just like a moment where we were, at this action, and I was like, that's like a cool South Asian making cool prints and distributing them, and it felt like an important moment for me. And then spending time with the scene has felt really urgent too. I mean, I think revolution is around us all the time, but I also feel like we're all still trying to make sense of things that happened in 2020, and spending time with this scene, I'm also reminded and brought back to that moment of first encountering your work. And I feel like, it feels like right now we're kind of, it feels like the world's doubling down a little, and it feels like there's like a reinvestment in police departments and a strengthening of the kind of status quo. And I feel like spending time with the scene kind of brings me back to that feeling of thrill, seeing a precinct burning, seeing people topple statues of slavers and throw them in the ocean. Like this, when people were really, people have always been imagining and will always imagine like alternative futures and world building, but I felt like obviously over the past few years there have been really critical moments of that feel fleeting, that feel inscrutable, and I think, it is really special to spend time with a project that is like slowing time down and also like pointing to moments of history that can give us hope and empower us and reassure us. And I think really specifically what's happening in India right now just feels like it's getting worse and worse, and I think people that are in diaspora, people that don't live there anymore, and I think we feel helpless on so many different levels about everything, but I think with that it feels really scary, and the ways that everyone's families are implicated, the way that your own senses of alienation and confusion are implicated is really hard. And I think that I think that this new issue is really a testament to like all the different types of resistance, the multiplicity of India, like all these different moments that we can look to and feel inspired by, and also just like what ethno-nationalism and far-right ethno-nationalism and what the state of India is trying to do is like consolidate and make this idea of India one thing. And then when we look to neocolonialism, when we look to all the extractive industries happening there, when we look to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and places that India affects immediately and colonizes immediately, I feel like this book, The Scene, is like a monument to all those different resistance practices. And we were kind of shooting the shit, and we were like, you were like, I want to talk about, like, there's some pages that I want to talk about. I want to talk about what brought me there. I want to talk about what's happening on the page and like what's in my head. And I was like, here are some pages that matter to me. One of which is this one, because I think that this idea of rinse and repeat like really stuck out to me, because I think for me it really like harkens back to how colonized nations like India, like Indonesia, like so many places like then become colonizers. And what is that rinse and repeat? And what is debt? I was just listening to this recording of Vijay Prashad at the COP26 in Glasgow last year, and he's just talking about debt and environmental debt, and it's a really amazing speech, because he's just like, fuck you guys, like all of the debt that we have, like here I am in Glasgow, like you guys have roads because we don't, like there's a direct kind of relationship. And I think that what's cool about this page is because it acknowledges both the structural, never-ending colonial debt that like currently decolonizing, endlessly decolonizing countries will have to work through, but also it kind of, I feel like it also incriminates places like India that also produce that debt in so many other places that I don't see.
Yeah, for me, I like just reminding people of the like political economy is like a really hard thing to understand understand, it's just it's like it's the left's like kind of like critical tradition, or at this point it's the left critical tradition against like mainstream economics. And mainstream economics is what creates these like insane debt packages that make some places like completely in bondage and other places completely like kind of in the position of pulling strings. And then like you see in news outlets, it's like, oh, why are these places like always in crisis? Why are they always racked with kind of like problems and kind of like inefficiencies and this and that? And you know, 16 IMF packages in 45 years means like one, I don't know, just more than every 5 or every 4 or something, I don't know. That's like, so just restructured and restructured and restructured, like continuing to cut out the public sector and make like life harder and harder to live and selling it out to kind of like corporations. And then like I think the deeper and deeper places are driven into kind of like austerity and debt, the deeper and deeper the forms of like just like belligerent violence and resistance will like come out. And like I mean, like, a lot of what I do sometimes is like riot porn, because it's like it's like just images that are, I mean, in this case, it's like these are images from major international news outlets about who are like portraying, who are like in the business of portraying indebted nations as kind of like chaotic places are in need of intervention or in need of some kind of like technical assistance and like expertise to guide them back on the good path. But they publish and produce these extraordinary images of like, you know, 3-layered barricades or like buses burnt and like thrown in a body of water, which I just think are like amazing. Like I just like want people to see that like human beings like did this. Like in the next image, I kind of like I want to like kind of temper that like kind of giddiness, because it's like it's not always just like a fixation or like a like happiness within destruction. It's like I think destruction in response to this kind of level of like structural oppression. I think you know, IMF debt packages are a form of like structural oppression that like waged against like the global south, like the formerly colonized world. You know, in other instances, like in the next page, I'm going to talk about the destruction of the Babri Masjid, which was 30 years ago, and like I was kind of like, both of us were just like born into like in the shadow of like this event, and like this is an example of like kind of like mass mobilized destruction that's like totally reprehensible to me. So there is this like weird like discord of like I like on the one hand I like love to revel in the idea that like, yeah, when you like kind of get together and you've had enough, you can do anything, but then it's also a really scary idea that like when you get together and have had enough, according to whatever kind of like measure or idea that you have collectively, you can do like really heinous things. And like so this is, I mean, there are probably plenty of people in here that don't know what this is referring to, and then I did not know what this was for a while, which is actually why I made a piece about it. It's like I encountered this image of like the people on top of the Babri Masjid, which is like a Muslim place of worship in North India, supposedly built on the ruins of a Ram temple, and this was like the reason that a bunch of Hindu nationalists or Hindu fascists like wanted to see it destroyed. And then in 1992 they eventually did do this, but I had seen this image, and it's this like silhouetted thing, and it reminded me of just like you know, like the types of like collective, like just like heroic collective imagery that I liked, and it had been in the back of my mind forever. I never knew what it was from or referred to, and then when I realized what it's from, I was like, oh, like this is like horrifying, and I wanted to make something that kind of acknowledged or like was able to like deal with this like actually like really terrifying ambiguity. And like I yeah, there's this tendency, or there's this discourse of like this idea of like a horseshoe theory, which is like the radical left and the radical right actually have more in common than not. And I think that's a fucking reprehensible idea. And yet, this was like, I think the place where that is like most easy to kind of see how or it's like most risky is in the realm of aesthetics. It's like, you know, in the aesthetic realm is where like these ideas can kind of like flourish. And so that's kind of the reason I made this, and the reason this project was a really hard kind of tormented process for me to do, because there's so much in contemporary South Asian political life that there's no reference. Like, I don't have that much of a reference point for it. Like, I actually only speak English. I was born here. I'm like very much like an ABCD, like through and through. And so my perception of South Asia is sort of like constantly being built up by it's like a political pursuit to try to understand it or try to reckon with it. And there's like some kind of the drive is always like to find out like what all the blind spots are, and like how this kind of like these like dense and like complicated terrain there is like how we can kind of like bring to like how we can sort of like use it to have a little bit more like wisdom or understanding about like what kind of like political terrain we face here. And I don't know, it's kind of like a strange like goal or idea. Like, it's kind of like a difficult thing to like try to navigate, but I think it's like an important attempt or something to do.
Well, it's also cool to like arrive at these struggles by way of other struggles, and I think the zine also is like, it's a monument to so many things, but I think to like solidarity networks and to the connection between the Caribbean to Kashmir to Palestine. You know, it's like you're at Standing Rock and you see a pro-Palestine like flag, and then you're at the action on Nakba Day and you see the Free Kashmir flag, and you know like these networks are really important, and it's really empowering to be like also kind of feeling alienated, being aware of all these terrible things happening in India, being aware that like my family, well, they're just like really like senile and provincial. I mean, I just have my grandparents, like they're just chilling in communist Kerala, like they aren't really aware of what's going on, and like feeling alienated by that, and like my political consciousness around India also coming through all these other ways that I started really caring about what was happening around me here, and like feeling connected to something global by like admitting to what's wrong, to like the struggles that are in your backyard.
I don't know if this is an open conversation.
Please, yeah, I wanted to say that, yeah. Like,
well, what you were saying about like navigating what it is, you know, being born here and, you know, being first generation or whatever have you, and why the desire. This is something that my parents have talked to me about. I think it's like in our blood memory, you know, as people that are from places that have been colonized by, you know, either like European countries or like the masses and elsewhere, and to be a part of that diaspora, that is the disconnect of not knowing. But I feel as though learning about the stories of, you know, our ancestors, the people before us, like we are the physical representation of these actions, and whether that they were so far away in history, I feel like, you know,
for me, that knowledge of knowing these things that have happened to the countries that my parents are from gives me power to stand in my politics here, and like, and it affects like my consumer ethics, it affects my relationships, it affects what I eat, like where I shop even. And so I feel as though even though like, you know, riot porn, why am I so obsessed with this? But the thing is like that's a lot of it's a lot of truths, and one of your pieces is called like, something in the golden cage or something like that, or the golden cage. I feel as though those places don't have that golden cage. So these images that are like pixelated or whatever have you, like we're seeing them filtered through, but like, you know, ignorance is bliss, you know? So it's like, yeah, like we really begin to talk about capitalism, but that golden cage lining or whatever is essentially like the bumper in a pinball machine where nothing is coming in, it's just bouncing off. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, like America as a cage of gold is like something that Mexican migrants would say, starting in the 80s when circular migration stopped being allowed to happen, and then people would be stuck in the U.S. And then so it's like the idea that the U.S. is a cage of gold, and I think it totally applies to this because it's like actually if you're born in if you're from South Asia but born here in the States, or you came here, you're kind of encouraged not to have any sort of like political consciousness that like extends to understanding how class, caste, and like other social dynamics play out in the South Asian subcontinent. You're sort of encouraged to partake in a kind of like pretty smug like neoliberal multiculturalism here, where like, you know, you're a POC and you're like kind of slighted by certain things, but you're also like well-to-do and like advantaged in these other ways. But like, I don't know. It's like increasingly like, you know, in the Biden era, which I like didn't like recognize as like a time until recently. Like it's like really like encouraged to kind of like play into this like glibness while like doubling down, like Sunny was saying, on like the worst shit that was like that came before the George Floyd rebellions, and like that like wasn't like doubling down on the things that there were fights against before those rebellions happened. And then it looked for a second like there might be some ground to be gained from like left positions, like leftist ideas, and then that is like that hope is totally gone. And then I think so yeah, I didn't even introduce myself or this thing. Sorry. But the reason I did this in particular, and like the reason why I'm like trying to work through these images with a captive audience is that like all that kind of like counterinsurgency and like just like response to the 2020 rebellions here and around the world made me like really want to look back into parts of like what has been going on in South Asia over the course of my lifetime, which has like been a like stark rightward turn that's like gaining a lot of ground by aligning itself with other like very powerful right-wing forces, and so like to like kind of look into the like to dive into reflecting on those and to kind of celebrating the like forms of insurgency against that is why I did this, and then and it kind of like keeps my head spinning. So yeah, so I'm good at this is I'm really glad this one is the next one. This is kind of like a really illustrative example of like why I wanted to do this. Can anyone on the screen, can you like even read this thing? No, it's like super pixelated. But this is just I'll like move through it quickly, but it's like this is a poet from where my family's from, but from a completely different social position, and use a dedicated Dalit communist who translated like an extraordinary amount of text into Telugu in service of the like Telugu Dalit movement, and like the communist movement in particular. And he wrote amazing poetry. He wrote songs for movies for money sometimes. He's like from my parents' generation, but died like in his 50s, which is insane. And it's like a product of like the occupational hazards of like being a radical and like someone from an oppressed social position in India. And to like sort of kind of like seek out and find these kind of examples of like cultural production, and then to do something with them. They're not that easy to find, but they're not that hard to find either. And to do something with them, to kind of like celebrate them, represent them, reproduce them in print, to me is just like, this is like the positive end of this project, like the most exciting part of it. And it's like, it goes back to the thing I was saying about Sangha, and like half of what this project is, which is like celebrating the living dead of like radical movements. So it's hard to find a lot of his, but this poem, you can read it in the printed version, and it's really amazing, and I recommend it.
I think because of this moment of maybe a little bit of illegibility, I kind of want to sit with that question a little bit around legibility and illegibility, and I think that like I think the zine kind of like moves through moments of like, this is really lucid and I can read and see what's going on, and then like texture and dissonance and like images layered on top of each other, and like playing with legibility in all these different ways that I think can also be abstracted to talk about identity and representation and like making yourself legible to the state and neoliberalism, and then like insurgency and like burning shit down, and then I think that really links back to like what you were saying about like aesthetics and like looking at this image of Babri Masjid and being like, if you don't know what's going on, like who's right and who's wrong, and who's wrong in burning something down and who's right in resisting, and all of that. But yeah, I'm also just like, when we see so many images of revolution and resistance and struggle, I think there's also this question of like, what are the stakes of representing this? And like this question of riot porn, like what are the stakes of representing violence? And to is it a means to an end? And I think I really liked your inclusion of Harsha Walia, who wrote this book, Border and Rule, that's really beautiful, and like a really leftist internationalist project of abolishing borders and why, and like what it was happening everywhere. Like it's so comprehensive. But she says this thing that's kind of like, we document violence in order to fight back against it, and it's like a way to honor the lives that we've lost. And that basically like a politics of remembrance is like the opposite of neoliberalism, which is like a politics of commodification and spectacle, and that remembrance is like an act of honoring. And so I'm just curious, like those are just some thoughts I've had, but also just process-wise, like I'm curious about the different typefaces you use and fonts you use and different ways you're writing, and some of which kind of like it has like a Sanskrit vibe when you see the same, like the two types on the page, and just your relationship to like legibility and like the what's the word, the kind of like disintegration of the image that you're playing with.
Okay. So when it comes to legibility, one of the first things like that I do in this, and that I like really like to do in graphic art in general, is like I like to work with other languages. I like to work with other scripts, even though I have no idea how to speak any other language than English, or how to read any other language than English. I think it's like a really important thing to try to do. One thing that I've realized over time, or in like studying lefty shit, is that most a lot of dedicated communists knew so many languages. And that's how internationalism worked, is that like people trained themselves in languages and trained themselves in translation. And like I just think that's like such an amazing kind of like human feat. it's people being more ambitious than like the kind of like the boxes that they're like kind of like confined into. So like yeah, like one thing on like my relationship to like illegibility or like my thoughts about like it's like I really try to push myself to work outside of any kind of like what I actually like know how to like interpret on my own. But like I need these kind of like crutches or like they're like I've like written Hindi on like a bunch of like things that I've done graphically, and then like I'll show it to like one of my parents or like someone I know who like can read Hindi, and I'll be like, does that make sense? Or like, does that actually like work? And usually they say yes. I'm like, oh, thank you. But thank you. Like I wasn't sure, but on the other end, with like with the images part, I think it kind of depends on how degraded or non-degraded the image was to start with. And like sometimes like or it's tended to depend on that, or like that's been the general parameters, but like I come from like an aesthetic background of like kind of like ultra degraded, like technically degraded images, just like photocopies and like kind of like Xerox transfers and methods like that. And so that look really appeals to me. And like okay, for example with this one, this is a YouTube screenshot of this guy reading, because that's all. There's like very little available of him. There's very little like ready-made imagery of this person. That's like why if those are the instances in which like the act of remembrance and representation feels like most vital or important. And then instead of like showing like shitty pixelated image in like full color, I figured like, oh, if I can degrade this to look like a photocopy and kind of have this like traceable quality, I think that's actually like more pleasing and like more interesting, and it kind of like sends it back in time more, or like makes it a little bit more timeless. So there's like, I don't know, that's like I feel funny sometimes or like being like I'm being anachronistic or something, like working with a kind of like photocopier style aesthetic. But then when I think about like doing it from a YouTube screenshot, again, it just like I get a weird fucking kick out of it. It just like makes me laugh, and I think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's a shit in here. It's photocopied. I mean,
Yeah.
no shade to the photocopied.
Yeah, I mean, this is an institution built to honor the photocopy.
Yeah.
In some way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it speaks to the kind of the past present kind of dialectic, as you said, in terms of the relationship between the YouTube interface and kind of like coming from a generation and the searching quality, that's like that desire that kind of comes out through just search engines, right? And the kind of like literal written desire to like want to connect with something or find a trace of something.
Yeah.
And I love that there's that connection with the kind of analog connection, or like any other kind of more physical material, and having this blending of the past and present and the analog and the digital represented. I think it speaks very directly to the way you're working at.
Maybe. I want to talk about everything. Yeah, I think that actually what was interesting to me about this page was this moment of using the first person. So I feel like there is this you're writing from your perspective. Like there's this moment where you're shifting through all these different like historical moments and this collage that you're presenting to us of like revolutionary moments. And then we're here with this like with this moment, and you're writing from your voice, and I was just kind of wondering, because that kind of like is sprinkled through the zine, but I think there's also this like desire to set the record straight, and I feel like even in reading it, I'm like, this is the truth. Like, these are the things that happened, and this is what struggle looks like, and that matters. And then just like the shift in being like, this is how I'm interpreting this, and this is like my hand making this, felt like important to talk about. And I also just feel like, you know, when writing about revolution and when writing about struggle in the global south, in the third world, or whatever, like, I feel like these kinds of conversations get siloed, and it's like about speaking to or addressing whiteness in some kind of way. And so like writing from the first person, you know, has been kind of a political tool for a long time, but then you run up against this desire to set the record straight, or be like, this is the truth. And yeah, I guess it just, when I was reading this, it made me think a little bit about this question of like who you're writing for, or who this is for, you know, like what your like ideal audience is. And I think it's also something like working at Print and Matter and constantly thinking about distribution and circulation, especially of like books that I really care about and I really want to get out into the world, and also get out of the West. I'm curious too, just like thinking about, I mean, this is a side conversation that also has its pragmatics around like how I can get this book to India and how I can get this book to all these other places. But also, yeah, just this question of audience, this question of like you placing yourself in the zine and like navigating that walking that tightrope, and like, yeah, where you want this to live.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I want anyone who can find something curious or interesting or whatever to like interact with this, but for the most part, it's like, I guess this was an attempt to try to connect with other people from the South Asian diaspora or from South Asia who relate to this, or like who are like invested in this kind of politics. But then people in general from migrant backgrounds or from backgrounds in the global south who can recognize something of the politics that like they confront or they experience in the places that they're from in this work. And then I kind of forgot that I just like wrote this. Like I like do this stuff like pretty frantically at times, but then like this is the voice of like that actually kept me from doing this, like completing this project in general, of trying to make it authoritatively legible to somebody who doesn't have some kind of way of understanding like what's going on here, or some like background knowledge, or just like a capacity to recognize what's going on in the content that's like presented here. But like I think it felt good to like write like, or to like kind of like express these kind of like basic sketches of like what I think of as like they're usually considered like pretty disparate, but like like India's spectacle society, yeah, turns like it has like these specters, and like Naxalites are one of them, and then Pakistan is the other one. Pakistan is like this like extraordinary specter of like Indian society. And so, like, I just think, like, the kind of, like, globalization of this, like, right-wing media language is important to, like, kind of recognize and, like, how it plays out in, like, a specific content text. So this is, I feel like, a particular example of, like, trying to make that desire to connect with any audience who might be able to recognize something in the dynamics here. This is, like, a good example of that attempt, whereas elsewhere I feel like it might be like a little bit harder to see, but I hope it's like there. It's there. This is another. This is kind of like different source material that I've been talking about for most of this, and that I was like interested in identifying. This is like more like historical stuff, and then there's like even a picture that I took in Hyderabad myself, like the last time I was there. But it's all stuff to kind of accompany this kind of like these like demonstrative slices of like theoretical insight coming from the left, from like a committed, action-oriented left. And in this case, this is Anuradha Gandhi, who's an amazing thinker and like an amazing political fighter, who again was like died prematurely from the generation that my parents were born in, and yeah, that like in this instance, it's like pretty like my hope is just to kind of call together a bunch of stuff that like kind of relates and like makes people curious about like that person or like those ideas, and like kind of like drops you straight into the process of trying to learn about this stuff. And like I hope that it kind of like gets wheels turning or like gets people excited. Like I feel like when I've showed this to some people who are like South Asian and like on the left, like they've been like hyped, so like, that was but yeah, that's pretty much it on this. And in this case, the source images are like old photojournalism, which is like a lot of what I draw from, or what I've tended to draw from. Yeah. Damn, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff we could talk. Maybe let's do this one. This is kind of an outlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just this question of who our heroes are, you know, and like I think that this was the first time I learned about Eric Cope and Black Dog Bone, and it I think it like has made me like spending time with this page. I was like curious about how like I've seen Tower 7 play, like I'm familiar with your music, and like I'm curious about, I think apart beyond just like I think what's aesthetically evident, like the influence of punk on your like more activist practice and scene making practice, and then also just like I feel like when we were having dinner the other week and we were just talking about people we think are cool, and then also being like, well, would you ever shot from a little bit of a twinkie, or like, you know, just like these moments where you're like, these people are really cool, but also like, you know, like who do we idolize and why do we idolize these people, and like what's cool about that and what's useful about that, and also like not that there's anything, I don't know anything nefarious about Eric Cope, but just, you know, I think this question of like who we look up to when there aren't that many out there. Yeah.
I thought like I found out about this band through a friend like who's like I've been on like played music with and on tour with, and then I looked into the background of it, and I was just like totally him, and I was like totally floored because it like this guy traveled through all these different like all this different terrain that like I've seen in some capacity. Like I've like stopped in Dubai on the way to India, like just through the airport, and it's like fucking terrifying. And then like and like the fact that this person's kind of like passed through these same spaces, but like a generation before me again, and like even punk, to see us out there, like it's kind of rare. It's kind of not something I know of, and that's like it's been a thing that I've like felt weird about, or like made me feel like kind of like an outsider in like wherever I am, like whether it's like if it's a South Asian space, then I'm like no, like there's no like punk isn't a thing, or then if it's like punk space, then it's like, you know, there's very few ABCDs even, but like I just found this like his story like it just resonated with me as like I wanted to tell all my friends and bandmates about it, and I did, and like it's like cool to just be able to see this like that there is like to cut past this alienation that like I sometimes feel and the different interests that I have, and like see it, and like this is kind of like a callback to like I started doing zines I started doing punk zines when I was a teenager, and so that's where my familiarity with the format comes from, and that's like what like kind of like a lot of my roots come from, and so I wanted to like honor that and like put it into this context where just kind of like drop it in and like give a kind of like nod to like where I'm like coming from more than not. And funnily enough that you mentioned like Tinky shit, like this guy, when he tried to join up with like an armed group, like I looked into them and it was like weird, like honestly, like it's not, like they were pretty reactionary, like from what I could kind of glean at the moment. But they also laughed him out of the place. Like, he went back to Sri Lanka and they're like, what the fuck are you doing here? Like, go away. And so he went back to the Bay Area and like started like a legendary hip hop, like a rap magazine, and like continued to live a different life. And I find that really interesting and inspiring. So yeah, this is just like this weird kind of outlier thing, but that like, Suko is an amazing artist too, so I thought it was fun to like give a nod to her. And like, it's just like insane to see, like, it's just kind of, this is kind of like an odd kind of encounter in like history or something, and it's like cool to like spell it out in this context or something. Yeah. We have this one.
Which I feel like is just same, I think
Same.
like both, same in some ways. This is like, a statue of Lenin that the far right in India toppled, and like, I just think it's interesting because like the history of Marxist-Leninism and insurrection and like third world Marxism in India is so strong, and it's interesting to see this moment also in the context right now of like monuments, to think about all the monuments that are being toppled from the other side. And yeah, again, just this question of like of who we look up to and who are the kind of revolutionaries that are guiding our light. Not that it's Lenin for me necessarily, but I just thought like those two pages were interesting to me in this week.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like, I guess for me it's just like, I did this because like, one, the image of Lenin, like Lenin's like likeness just like crushed is just a crazy thing to look at, and then to realize that there were even statues and like busts created of Lenin in South Asia is like kind of this thing that like it feels like I wasn't supposed to know, and then literally it does feel like that because it's being torn down by kind of like the forces that like have the most kind of dominant like force.
Yeah, and it just feels like what ethno-nationalism in India and everywhere is doing is revision and like choosing what is told and what isn't. And like, we were talking the other day about like I think this is like a really important thing to know that also connects like what is happening in India and what is happening here. And there's so much, but like I'm from the Bay Area, I'm from California, and the Hindu American Foundation, which is like APAC but India and Indian, they like, and APAC is the biggest Israeli lobby for people who don't know. They like started this massive campaign, I don't actually remember exactly when it was, but like early 2000s, to take any mention of caste out of all California state textbooks, because they were like we don't do that anymore, and also it looks really bad on Indians. Like you can't say that in India there's a history of like oppression. Like no, we're all equal, and it's the British and the white people that are oppressing us, not like us oppressing our own or whatever. And I think this project of like, of historical revisionism, of choosing new idols, of like, even going back to Babri Masjid, it's like there's so much mourning in what's happening specific to that story. And then I find myself like with friends just like kind of laughing because you're like, these people are so fucking dumb. Like, they're like, archaeology, like, there was a temple here 600 years ago, like, it was here, and like, just like this kind of pseudoscience and like historiography, like far-right historiography, like sometimes you have to step back and be like, fools. And I also just, I think that like this moment of them taking Lenin down is like a larger thing, where it's like there are just very few places in India right now that like the left still has a stronghold, and it's interesting when they approach it in this way. That's like it's so public and symbolic.
And that active historical revision, when it comes to a figure that's like made to be as controversial as Lenin, it's really interesting just to note that like Lenin had an actually active role in like kind of coordinating and facilitating like anti-colonial revolutionary forces, whereas the RSS were just kowtowing to like the Nazis, the British, like anyone who would listen and anyone who would kind of accommodate their like totally. I mean, their worldview is totally sympathetic too, and the reason it actually like has power is because they collaborate. They're pro-business. They collaborate with like kind of the dominant like economic values like of capitalism, imperialism, etc. And like that isn't what all of the anti-colonial movement was about. Like most of the anti-colonial movement was built on something, or a lot of it was built on something else, like a vision of like another more liberated world. And it's just it's kind of like this deep and extraordinary thing to like reckon with, like that there, to me again, like from being in a U.S. position, that there's a place where a statue to Lenin would be raised for this, and for like this kind of like role, and that he'd be then like torn down, like based on like a really thin justification, which is like a foreign like a foreign figure or something. I don't know. So yeah, I don't know. It just like stays kind of fascinating to me. There's a lot of the stuff in this publication. It's just kind of like things that I just felt like very fixated on. It's like, wow, how do I make this maybe interesting to other people? And, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna finish it off with this one, and like just to kind of give like a more general. It is an opportunity to give like a kind of more general background of where all this image making and like stuff comes from. This is a piece like actually representing like Indo-Caribbeans, and it's like the drawing is taken from art that I did in my band Kaleidoscope's 7-inch, and it's a song about indentured laborers. So it's called Gimatia, because we lived in like I lived with my bandmates, they still live there, in Flatbush, and we were just like constantly eating and surrounded by like kind of like Indo-Caribbean culture, and I wanted to like make an ode to like kind of that history that kind of goes like critically read, or like it's just kind of like glazed over, like, oh, how did they get there, like what is that? And yeah, the more general theme I wanted to get across is that like captive labor makes like the modern world that we know, and like the modern world that we know was kind of like pioneered in colonial locations in the global south. Like my friend talking about, and he's here, I'm not gonna put him on blast, but he said to me, Indian culture is actually extremely modern, and that blew my mind entirely, because I was like, oh, I'm so used to hearing all this grasping for like this ancientness and this like historical. It's all historical revisionism. There's so much of that is what that idea is rooted in, and so to think about like the modern world as like kind of being pioneered in these places, and then to like represent it through the actual work. I don't know. That was that's like a big part of what I wanted to like the undertow of what I want to convey and stuff that I do. And then like it also like so much of this stuff that I do in this project and that I've done it like do as an artist comes from like trying to express these ideas through like any possible medium, and it kind of feels weird to do it just in this like flat print medium, but I hope that it like creates like, I don't know, more opportunities to kind of like explore or like dive into the things that are represented here, because sometimes it feels like this is the format where you can do something like try to talk about all the different textures or layers in it. And so I appreciate all of you coming out and listening to this. And
A chain built by weak links can't hold our worlds.
yeah, that's from the Kaleidoscope record.
It's a good one.
Thank you. Yeah, well,
Hey, I have a question I want to ask. So you guys are like doing like basically cultural work or like making zines that touches on anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements even today. Like you guys mentioned the Naxalites in Dandakriya. That's like a pretty big hotbed of revolutionary activity that's happening amongst indigenous and communists. And not just some revisionist people who just push out the props of saying that they're communists just because they have a hammer and sickle, but they're actually living by the actual standards where they push out like a lot of revolutionary culture. As the Comrade Rest in Power that you sent pushed up out earlier from Telugu, he translated English text to Telugu. Like his involvement into cultural work was not just also like how to encourage people and using art as a tool to be accessible to the actual oppressed and exploited people that we're talking about. So I want to know as like what advice will you give and what do you also like to see eventually of these works that you're doing, how you want to inspire other artists that to also question, because as you were explaining earlier, I feel like you're just like me, like I grew up in South out here too, really tired, not knowing my language too, you know, like I get what you mean by ABC. But we're like desperate researchers that we want to seek our history and we want to know our anti-colonial history. So I just want to know like if there's any advice that you have in that regards.
I mean,
To other artists
I
as
feel
well.
like you would have better advice if you're out.
No, I mean, but like advice to other artists in regards to how to serve the people, because you know these things we don't want to just sensationalize these movements.
Right.
And like as you guys explained it earlier, like ultimately knowing that these are actually struggles that are happening today and that are influencing people around the world. Someone like yourself knows about literally struggles that happen in your own homeland, and knowing that there's actually anti-colonial struggles going on. There are other seekers just like you know, where are also trying to find this. But we also know that like it can't just be in spaces like in our book space. Like how do we bring it to the actual youth that we want to actually see this? Because we know the work that we do out in Kensington, we would love to have more of these copies and also like teaching people how to make zines that are also related to their, you know, people's struggle. You know. So yeah, I think I'm talking a bit too much now.
No, I mean, I think so. I kind of just to explain like my motivation for doing this is like I tried to make this thing as like an art object to like catch as many people's attention as I could, and then connect with people like you, and try to share it out for other reasons and in other ways, and to talk more. I feel like it's easier to me at least to like I said, just like the way I do this stuff is like really improvisatory, but in relationships you can kind of like make sense of like I make sense of what it is that I even do through like connecting with people relationally, and then other people can kind of like take what they will from that and do different things. That's kind of my hope with this, because I think one of the things that made me super self-conscious about like kind of following through with this project is like why am I doing this, who is this for? And then it's like it's for people to like kind of pick up and recognize something, and then like to kind of work with and like deconstruct, I guess. So like I don't know, there's like the lovely thing about the zine format is that it's like it is really something you like take apart the thing and you can kind of see how it's made or like what it is. And it's a lot of things that are like readily accessible and available, and like with practice it takes on like it can take on all sorts of different dimensions, but there's like it's an easy thing to jump into, I think, and that's why I do it, and that's why even though I have a hard time with it sometimes, but that's why I want to make it, because I was inspired to do zines by seeing other people's zines, and I think the cycle sort of continues that way. Does that feel like a decent answer?
I mean, no, it's just the advice to give it to other artists. You know, like I'm an artist myself. You know, like I've been an artist for a good minute, but well, I feel like what we need to do is try to figure out how to bring like this art. Like this is fire pieces. I have not ever seen anyone in New York City push out something that's actually talking about the Maoist movement. Because honestly, people are afraid to talk about the Maoist movement, even back home or even here. And
Yeah.
this piece shows it. And I think like this is the type of zine that we want to see in our hoods. Like we want to see this in the Bengali community. You know, we want to see this in the South Asian community because we see a lot of NGOism as
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
as the main force of organizing. When it's like, yo,
Yeah.
there's always gonna be a class divide on even amongst the different South Asians. And we out here in La Murich, that's the organization we're part of, where we're trying to see as well similar people pushing out this type of politics and history. And we know that we have to we need to be able to evolve our struggle even from the Bengalis outside of just Bengalis. Because we know where we're organizing is not just Bengali people. We also got Mexican people, we got indigenous people, you got Palestinians, you got Pakistanis as well. You know,
Yeah.
so like I really, I think the artists who are also out here and also like sharing this message where it's like this is just the beginning and we need to be able to bring this to literally to the actual people that we're trying to serve. But that is back home in different parts of South Asia or even here. There's like South Asian youth out here. We have our roles here as well as the diasporas where we play a key role to be able to connect the revolutionary forces here to the revolutionary forces back home. You know, so that's my point is just we gotta bring this art to the people, you know, revolutionary art to be more example on the because there's all types of art, but yeah.
I agree. Yeah, I want to do that.
I wanted to say something about, to echo a bit off what you were saying, and also in regards to like the specific piece and it being a part of the EP you were mentioning about, like, I think also too your images not only just reach out to those that are South Asian, but those that have a similar like history or history in regards to colonization and speaking about like living in an Indo-Caribbean like neighborhood. And I remember like the first one that you like put out, and then when you gave me an Emil Cabral book, and then it like started to pique my like curiosity about like my own background. And I think there's a difference between like nationality and like ethnicity. Like I had a conversation with Shiva before, but I found out that like I'm trying to think. Well, my mom's grandma was Indian, and I never knew, you know. And so it's really interesting thinking about like what someone was saying about India being part of like the modern world, where it's like where my mom's from, there's no indigenous people there. They brought people from like India and like all these places, and the nationality was like, this is what you are. Like you are Portuguese and you know about these things because they were here. But when we think of like ethnicity and what that looks like in genealogy, that the lines get blurred after a point in time. So it's like not only does this connect South Asians and their like the narrative of what the things that have happened in that part of the world, but also like the narrative of the things that have happened in other parts of the world that have been forgotten about or not even documented. And so I think that's a way too that this is bringing other people together, other classes together, and also other not necessarily nationalities, but like ethnicities at that. Especially because through the diaspora, maybe you don't think that you're never enough or something, but what bonds people of the diaspora is these stories that are not necessarily documented in an academic, either they are documented in very dense academic containers of universities and anthropologists that study dead languages and all that bullshit, or they're documented in a very radical way that is not necessarily digestible for that higher class of academia, i.e. Harvard or, you know, anthropology bullshit or whatever.
Yeah, and I think like I don't know, we just have to proliferate more of the like sharing of different diasporic like stories, like things that make connections between like different experiences that like you know like it's like there's such like insane harm and loss to life to happen through like capitalism and imperialism, and yet it also brought lots of people in contact with each other and open possibilities for people to be in solidarity with each other in ways that just didn't happen before, and that's like what forms the basis of like possible bridge resistance, like that there has to be some hope in that. I don't know, like I keep obsessing over these connections that keep showing up to me between like Mexico and South Asia, like the founder of the Mexican Communist Party, Bengali. You know?
That is so funny. I'm sorry.
It's
That is so funny
Yeah.
because I know about that, and I just find it to be
It's
funny.
crazy, right? I think about it with you guys all the time. So
Yo,
Mo
buddy,
and
he's
Z are
a
like,
clown though.
sorry, we're not gonna put you on blast.
I gotta be honest.
But
That's why I
that's-
study history because it's true. But I get what you're saying. Like, we did like meeting, and it does bring people together, and then send them out there too. By the way.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah,
So I don't know, those kind of connections, they're a real part of like
that's funny.
our like the history of like radical struggle, and like we don't know about it. It's easy. Yeah.
Yeah, just on that note too, I mean, there's so many stories like that. There was this guy, Pia Gama Pinto, who was going from India, and he was fighting with the Mau Mau in Kenya.
Oh shit.
And yeah, so like he became a part of the newly independent regime in Kenya after they gained independence, and he was like a major freedom fighter. And he was assassinated. He was the first martyr, essentially, of post-independence Kenya. But the thing is that what's fascinating about these stories is that just as much as it is that they're united by struggle and mutual struggle, is it's also like, I mean, there were real tensions between South Asians and Indians and Kenyans, right? Like, and I think a lot of it is, there's so much, the colorism, it just plays so deeply into so much of these relationships in South Asia too, amongst caste, like, you know, Dalits and communists. Like, a lot of the critique of Communist Party of India is that it was an upper caste movement that really never truly improved the material conditions for people, Dal people specifically, or Adivasis as well. But it's interesting, the tension is where the struggle is formed, and so you have to like, you know, acknowledge these. So I'm interested in how you present certain struggles in relationship to each other that sometimes might be at odds with each other.
Yeah,
And
I,
I think,
I definitely noticed that. That's what I was wondering. Like,
yeah.
I know what you're saying because even with the Communist Party, Marxists are actually, if we're talking about like historically, they have sided with neocolonialism and neoliberalism
Yeah,
on a rather
totally.
like bad. But what I've also noticed is that like we do have rich history. You know, this is what I say again. We don't want to sensationalize movements. We want to learn from the movements. So like even amongst to this day, unfortunately, even Vijay Prashad, that's his party that he's involved in. They push out neoliberalism. They push out specific rhetoric, communist socialist rhetoric, but then in practice, whenever Naxalites or rebellions are fighting against the Central Reserve police officers in India, the Communist Party, Marxists, both Kerala and West Bengal, they do side with, unfortunately, with the mainstream wing. And it's not to say that like there aren't individuals, of course, we can find individuals, but definitely, I just want to give highlights again. Like you're also mainly highlighting a lot of mouse movements, and that's the thing where I feel like we don't see that a lot here a lot, and I give you props for that because we don't see that. No, on some real shit, we don't see that. We see Vijay Prashad. To be real, that's what we see. And if you go back to South Asia, people don't really like him in his party because they know what his party does. But you put in Anurana Gandhi. We fuck with Anurana Gandhi OD. Like we learned a lot from political feminism and a lot of different other positions that we learned from also a lot of those writers, so we give you homage for that. But yeah, like that's something I noticed too. From what they tell me.
I mean, the Maoists are just like their stories in South Asia are amazing. Like, and I mean, and there's just so much more. Like, there's this book put me on the path to like making this thing. It's called Ants Among Elephants by Sujata Gidla. She's from Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, and she's a subway conductor out in New York City now. So she lives here, somewhere in South Brooklyn. I want to at some point track her down because I have a lot of questions. But I read her book during the May 2020 uprising. I was reading her book during then, and I showed it to my mom, and it was like, she was just like totally floored by the fact that like all the geography of it was familiar to her, but from a completely different perspective, because her ancestors were major organizers in like the Naxalite uprisings in Andhra and Telangana. And like it's like ugly personal history a lot of the time, but it's just like the fact that she's putting it out there and siding with those politics ultimately, in spite of like the kind of deep personal flaws that were attached to that history and that she saw play out like in traumatizing ways as a child. It's like she pisses off a lot of the like older Maoists in India with how she wrote about it, and yet it's like there's she's still like kind of like acting in solidarity with like their actual ideals, and I think that's amazing. And that's kind of like that's why I permitted the kind of like culture clash, or like literally like political clashes, like kind of like contradictions that exist in this thing, because I think it's like we have to practice holding many more truths if we're gonna like try to band together and like figure out how to collaborate and recognize a lot of parts of history.
If anyone doesn't have any burning questions, we're coming to the end. We're hitting the 8 p.m. wall. But also you can find us in various ways, online and email, and I think you probably we know each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much for being